Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. New data show prices are still rising, and you probably don't need us to tell you that that includes prices for food. It was against this backdrop that the Biden administration recently convened a summit on hunger, nutrition, and health. It was the first such effort in decades, and it's part of a bigger push to marshal both government and philanthropic resources toward ending hunger and food insecurity in America. For more on this, we're joined now by Craig Willingham, Managing Director of the Urban Food Policy Institute, based at the CUNY School of Public Health and Health Policy in Harlem, New York. Craig Willingham, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you for having me.
So much to unpack. We'll start with some data. According to the USDA Economic Research Service, 33.8 million people in the US live in food insecure households. Could you just start by telling me a little bit about the scope of the problem as you see it?
Well, the scope of the problem has always been outsized for a nation like the United States that's a high-income country. And what we've seen in the last few years during the pandemic is that these underlying issues that contribute to food insecurity were exacerbated by the pandemic and resulted in millions more of Americans being affected by issues related to food insecurity. And what we now find ourselves in is a moment where we can take some of the lessons from the pandemic and build upon them to try to seriously address food insecurity in ways that it hasn't been addressed in decades.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us some kind of executive summary version, or what are some of the elements of the plan that you think are particularly helpful in moving this agenda forward?
Well, so far there's not a coordinated plan. Really, what we see are the remnants of the emergency response to COVID-19. And during that period, what we saw was increase in the amount of money going to food assistance programs, increase in the amount of money going to income support programs, and a host of other safety nets that are put in place by government and also civil society groups to help people who are in need. Now, what we've been talking about is this sort of concept of building back better, making sure that we don't lose the momentum that we had during the pandemic, where we saw millions of people being lifted out of poverty and millions of people being prevented from going hungry. We take that, we see that as a proof of concept, and we think about how we can take a more solidified approach towards making sure that we're serving every American and that no one is going without.
Now, you just mentioned that. Do you think that there's a kind of shared national understanding of the predicament that we find ourselves in?
Well, the Michelle Obama effort was really focused primarily more on nutrition, food quality, and physical activity, which is parallel to issues related to food insecurity and hunger. And one of the reasons why we saw such pushback to the sorts of things that she wanted to see happen, first of all, partisanship, but second of all, when you talk about nutrition, when you talk about quality, when you talk about these sort of things that many people see as being a bit more subjective than, say, someone going hungry, there's a lot more room for debate. So you can say, I want to put forth a meal that has, fresh fruits and vegetables and doesn't use fried foods, et cetera. And some people can push back and say, hey, fried foods is part of my, cultural diet. We don't eat lots of fruits and vegetables in my family. And, I should have the choice to be able to eat that fatty food versus, eat something that's healthy. And so when you talk about nutrition, when you talk about health, from a public health standpoint, and myself being a public health professional, we always want to make the healthy choice the easy choice, and we want a society where everyone has access to healthy and nutritious food. But again, when you make that sort of argument, there's a little bit more daylight between what's moral and what's right versus individual choice, whereas there isn't that same sort of situation when you talk about food insecurity and hunger.
New terms like food apartheid. And I wonder if you could sort of speak to these types of phrasing that are associated with people of color, and if that's part of the bigger issue, sort of the inequality and the racializing who has access to food.
So I'll preface my comments by saying I'm not from the Buffalo area, and
Hmm.
I haven't done any work or research from an academic perspective on Buffalo. So, all of my comments will be, should be taken as more general based on publicly available data and some of the
Sure.
comments that were made during the aftermath of the shooting there. So, in terms of the sorts of phrases that were being thrown around with regards to the food environment there, whether it be food apartheid, food desert,
Yeah.
other related phrases, these are concepts that have been used for decades for people who work on food,
Mm.
but really sort of came to the fore as part of the conversation around this particular shooting because it happened in a supermarket. And not only just a supermarket, but a supermarket that the neighborhood fought for years to get.
Mm.
And too often we see this in Black neighborhoods where we see examples of historical disinvestment. We see lack of opportunities for accessing fresh, healthy, and affordable food. And a lot of the advocacy around changing the food environment in those areas starts with getting a supermarket because a supermarket can act as a commercial opportunity for so many different things, whether you're shopping just for food or shopping for cleaning supplies, or in some cases, even utilizing a pharmacy that's attached to the supermarket. And so in Buffalo, there was a lot of work to get that supermarket opened up to make sure that folks in that area had access to a
Hmm.
full line supermarket. And with the violence that took place with the shooting there, turning that supermarket that so many fought to bring to the neighborhood into a place that people felt unsafe or that reminded them of this tragedy
Mm.
really seemed like an exacerbation of this issue of number one, anti-blackness, number two, making it so that the environment that Black people live, even if it's just going to the supermarket, is one that's always precarious and fraught.
Hmm.
And number three, making sure that it's the sort of thing that is a battle that needs to be fought in terms of making sure that store stays open, because there was a lot of call for that store to close after the shooting. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. It's 100% totally understandable because it's a site of a tragedy, and
Yeah.
for many people they'll never be able to shop there again. But some of the concern was that does this again put the neighborhood in a position where we don't have a full supermarket and that we can't access food in a convenient way?
Yeah. I mean, it's just sad all around. I'm also thinking about the senior citizens, and I've read, again, I'm not, I'm sort of like trying to get a better understanding of the entire situation, but I've read online as well that a lot of senior citizens shopped in this place, this particular supermarket. But I wonder, on a wider note, if we talk a little bit about senior citizens and food access in cities across this country in 2023 and what that looks like.
Hmm. Well, senior access to food for seniors really varies from setting to setting in terms of the urban environment. You have a place
Mhm.
like New York City where we're based, where there's a network of programs that overlap and provide a decent safety net for citizens, whether that be city meals on wheels, whether that be some of the congregate meal feeding programs that are at senior centers that are attached to senior living facilities. And it's in many ways one of the strongest approaches to making sure that seniors have access to food in New York City. But that's not the same in metropolitan areas across the United States. It really just depends on how important feeding seniors is to that particular area and what
Yeah.
sort of resources are in place. And moreover, when it comes to seniors and children, I have to say that it's often much easier to make the case for funding for these sorts of programs because they're sympathetic populations. If you're talking
Mhm.
about adults who are able-bodied but are either out of work or you know aren't making enough money to feed themselves, that's where you start to have more of an issue in terms of people who believe in having a robust safety net as opposed to those who believe that the bare minimum should be done if anything.
Data from the World Food Program consistently show that women are especially vulnerable to food insecurity and also its health consequences. I'm wondering, one, why is that? If there's any specific data on that, if you know, and does this data also ring true for women in the United States?
Well, again, I have to preface that I'm not an expert in terms of how food insecurity specifically affects women. Our
Hmm.
work tends to be a bit more general. However, I can say that what we've seen is that women tend to bear the brunt of economic downturns. They tend to bear the brunt of changes in the economy, and also we all know that women aren't paid in an equal way in terms of salaries. So all of those things play into the idea that when we talk about food insecurity and other issues that are public health issues facing society, women unfortunately share an unequal burden in those problems.
Hmm. The recent pandemic has been certainly a harsh teacher for food justice advocates. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the research that's coming out of your institute. I read online that there's a great deal of effort towards advocating for essential workers in the food delivery space. Can you talk a little bit about what the issues are and what you're advocating for?
Sure. Well, in the pandemic or during the pandemic, we put together a research project with colleagues at the New York City Food Policy Center at Hunter College, and also colleagues at the Laurie M. Tisch Food Policy Center at Teachers College. And through that work, we looked at several different categories, including food workers, um, agricultural production, food access, food insecurity, etc. And one of the things we found in terms of food workers is that, as many of us who live in major cities know, food workers were de facto essential workers when it came to getting food to people.
Hmm.
These aren't the sort of jobs that these workers initially signed up for. However, they became a vital pipeline for making sure that the people in the city remain fed. And one of the things that we and others who advocate for food worker rights and protections would like to see is more of a formalization of the importance of food workers, to
Mm.
see that formalization manifested in terms of the sort of pay rates that delivery workers are getting, the working conditions that they're getting, the connections between their rights and responsibilities in terms of being a contract worker versus
Mhm.
a full-time worker or a part-time worker in a traditional worker sense. And thankfully, New York City has been very proactive in regards to legislation being passed to change the way in which these food delivery workers have their relationships with these third-party apps like Grubhub, Seamless, etc., and also the restaurants that supply the food. And we're at a point now where we may even see a $23 an hour minimum wage for food delivery workers.
Wow.
And I think we probably wouldn't have seen that same amount of progress had it not been for the pandemic shining a light on the essential nature of those sorts of workers.
I wonder if we can, I mean, you touched on it just a little bit, if we could talk a little bit about the mental health needs of, and also the health and safety needs of these essential workers. But also, I think a bigger issue is just the mental health impact of food insecurity, right? Um, do you have any, what can you tell us a little bit about any data on that issue?
Well, food insecurity goes hand in hand with issues related to diet related diseases, mental health, etc. And often that comes from, again, living in a position of precarity. If you're in a situation where you don't have regular, consistent access to food, there are likely other factors in your life, whether that be, your ability to access employment, or your
Hmm.
being underemployed,
Hmm.
or your current health status, or where you live.
Yeah.
As we as public health researchers know, and many others know, finally this idea has been getting out there that where your zip code, the zip code of where you live, can tell you a lot about what the health profile is going to be on that person, their lifetime earnings, all of these different indicators of what it is to progress through society. And we think that one of the reasons why food is often talked about more than some of these other things is because food can be a proxy for so many different things. It
Yeah.
can be a proxy for your health. It can be a proxy for issues related to the environment. It can be a
Mm.
proxy for issues related to the workplace. And similarly, when it comes to public health and mental health issues, food is often seen as a proxy or an indicator as to how someone might be performing on those other metrics.
Right. I mean, you just touched on the very issue I wanted to talk a little bit about. This is the relationship between food insecurity and the environment. And I want to know if you could talk a little bit about the impact of gentrification on food environments. And I'm thinking specifically about New York City, but also more broadly, cities around the country, LA, Seattle, Denver, Atlanta, if you could sort of speak to what this relationship is and what it looks like.
Well, the relationship tends to be more affected by the concept of food access than food insecurity. Food insecurity necessarily. The two are often related. But in
Hmm.
terms of gentrification and the transformation of neighborhoods from ones that typically have large populations of low-income residents to
Hmm.
one that tends to be a mixture of low, middle, and high-income earners, what we see is a change in the definition of food access. So food access is not just proximity to food, meaning that food access isn't just I have a supermarket across the street or down the street.
Yeah.
Food access has a number of different dimensions. Those can be price, those can be cultural cues or environmental cues in terms of whether you feel welcomed or invited into a particular store versus another.
Yeah. Yeah.
They could also be something as innocuous as the music that's played in the places that you frequent.
Mm.
And New York City, because we live in such a concentrated area in terms of populations and different types of populations, um, we can often see this sort of inverse phenomenon of a food access issue where it's actually a sort of misnomer in the sense
Mm.
that it looks like there's lots of food options around, but
Yeah.
because of price, because of cultural signifiers, because of so many different things, the long-term lower income residents may not feel that they have access to those venues.
Hmm. So on point. What are the risks? I mean, it sort of leans into the next topic I wanted to talk a little bit about. Those are some of the risk of platform-based food delivery. Again, this idea that it seems like there's just so much food, but I wonder what the risks are of sort of living this way. And even coming out of the pandemic, it was a matter of convenience. But can you speak to some of the risk of platform-based food delivery?
Well, I think it's setting aside the whether there's a nutrition or public health risk or not. I think the primary risk we see, and it's one that we see in society more largely, is the consolidation of the ways in which we're able to access services. So, Seamless now owns Grubhub and I think a few other third-party apps. Uh,
Yeah.
and what the sort of story of this part of the 21st century, the early 21st century, really is about consolidation, whether it be consolidation of media, whether it be consolidation of food companies, whether it be consolidation of service companies in
Hmm.
terms of transportation, food delivery, etc. And I think that's really one of the greatest risks that we face, that we get to this point of consolidation where we really only have a handful of companies that are providing us with food, providing us with our transportation, you
Hmm.
know, on and on and on. And lots of this has been largely subsidized by investor funds that
Mm.
allow a company to operate at a loss for 10 years, 20 years, in
Yeah.
order to get to that point to be the only game in town at some point.
Yeah.
Then the prices go up. So you have a situation where maybe even low income people start to depend on these sorts of services. And all of a sudden, the true cost of operating these sorts of services starts to become more apparent when individual players become the only game in town. And we're
Yeah.
starting to even see that now. I mean, increasingly for those of us who use these third-party apps for delivery, the fees continue to go up and up and up to the
Yeah.
point where now you may pay an extra $10 for a meal that's only $15.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a tragedy. The Food Policy Institute recently published a brief summarizing key findings from an evaluation on Grow NYC Fresh Food Box. And really from what I read, to evaluate the implementation of the organization's Fresh Food Box program in South Bronx, in New York. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the purpose of the study and the principal findings that sort of devolved from that project.
Sure. So we wanted to partner with our colleagues at Grow NYC, which is an agriculture and food access and environmental organization here in New York City, to look at the effectiveness of providing fresh food boxes. So these would be boxes that have a variety of seasonal produce that's provided to low income residents at a reduced cost, if not free. We wanted to see how effective that approach could be. And one of the things that we really are interested in at the Institute is this idea of the community constructed food environment. So to
Mm,
connect this back to my previous comments about consolidation of delivery networks and others, that's where we see a market-based, a very sort of fixed and ultimately terminal approach towards the food environment, in that you end up having, one player who's distributing and manufacturing food, you have one player that's growing food, et cetera. Whereas the community constructed food environment is much more decentralized, and you
mm,
have an environment that speaks more to the natural nature of the way in which people interact, both with one another and with the built environment and with the commercial environment. And in a community constructed food environment, the focus is on making sure that people have access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food, as opposed to the market constructed food environment, which is really concerned with making sure that companies that are involved in the food environment and the food system can make money. And our work evaluating the Fresh Food Box program really was done with the purpose of being able to provide evidence for others to be able to use to see how effective taking this community food constructive food environment approach could be, and how this approach that Grow NYC was taking in the Bronx could be used as a model for other neighborhoods in New York City and other cities around the country.
nice. Can we talk a little bit then on this same point about predatory marketing in community and digital environments? I saw that there was some research that was done by your institute, and I wonder if you could sort of help us understand what the implications are.
Sure. So predatory marketing, for those who don't know, is different from targeted marketing in that it's the marketing of, in our case, in terms of what we look at, unhealthy foods to populations who are most affected by high rates of diet related diseases that are catalyzed by consuming those foods.
Hmm.
So when we think about predatory marketing, I think a good analogy would be cigarette advertisements or alcohol advertisements. There's been a long-standing issue in Black communities about advertising alcohol and advertising cigarettes. But we've seen much more progress in the last few decades in terms of addressing and controlling the marketing of alcohol and tobacco in Black neighborhoods. However, when it comes to unhealthy food, ultra processed food, we've seen very little movement on that. And what our research has done is to work on capturing what's been happening in terms of the predatory marketing in these neighborhoods, but also providing evidence for policymakers in order to make some of the same sorts of policy actions that were done in terms of restricting the marketing of alcohol and tobacco, take that same approach and use it when it comes to ultra processed unhealthy food. And here in New York State, Senator Zell Normiri from Brooklyn has introduced legislation to ban predatory marketing. And it's one piece of legislation that's been working its way through the state legislature, and hopefully we'll see a vote on it sometime in the near future.
Hmm. Let's talk policy in Washington, D.C. in particular. The Trump administration negotiated more than 50 trade agreements to boost market access and exports for American goods, foods, provided $30 billion in support to farmers and ranchers during COVID-19, and authorized more than $4 billion for innovative farmers to families food box program. And you've been involved in sort of your institute have been involved in sort of deconstructing some of that. Fast forward, the Biden administration recently announced plans to invest 9.6 million across the country and to really help farmers and ranchers and processors and rural businesses not only diversify their supply, but also get it to homes that need it most. what do policymakers, community leaders, maybe even academic researchers get right or wrong about the factors restricting food justice and food insecurity, sort of maintaining food insecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a multifaceted problem. So I don't think that there is a one size fits all. I think what we can say is that the way in which our food system is built upon agricultural subsidies, the way in which our food system encourages overproduction of the sort of base products like corn and soy, et cetera, that feed into the manufacturing of diet related or of ultra processed foods. Uh, I think one of the things that we could do is start there. And there has been some elected officials that have had that sort of discussion and would be interested in taking policy steps to address that. But the food lobby, whether that be big ag or whether that be big food,
Hmm.
is very powerful. And it really, even if they weren't powerful, it really would take a vision to completely remake our food system in a way that we've yet to see in any other country in the world.
Hmm.
Not that it can't be done, but it will take a cooperation of folks across the spectrum, folks who are concerned about food insecurity, folks who are concerned about agricultural issues,
Hmm.
even folks that are concerned about environmental and worker justice issues to come together
Hmm.
to figure out how can we find a shared goal or a set of shared goals and a shared agenda, and how do we move forward in terms of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to policy actions, and then how can we plan for the long term.
Yeah. I wonder if we could talk very briefly about Russia's unjust war or Russia's war on Ukraine. It has had, it has caused grain shortages and is really threatening global food security. As I'm reading about this and I'm thinking about our conversation, I guess I'm trying to understand the impacts of this crisis on food insecurity here in the United States, if there is a link at all.
I couldn't say whether there's a link or not. I mean, my areas of work and expertise does not focus on international trade agreements when it comes
Okay.
to moving food across borders. That said, I think what we can do is look at the disruption of the supply chains when it comes to a whole host of things during the pandemic, and we saw how easy it was for those chains to break down and to cause backups for months, if not years, in some cases. And so I think looking at that, we can get an indication of what something like, you know, decreasing the amount of grain exports from Russia, we can get a sense of what sort of impact that could have down the chain, whether that be in foods that are manufactured, whether that be in raw grain that's being used for bread, any host of ways.
Yeah.
We've depended so much on these sort of just-in-time delivery approaches and these very long supply chains that all it takes is one thing, going wrong within it, and it can have enormous reverberations around the world.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about what advocacy and activism should look like in this era? Um, and departing from just the work you've been doing with the Institute.
So, as a researcher, I wouldn't pretend to tell or know what advocates could do. I think they're the best ones to truly answer that question. What
Yeah.
I will say is that, again, we are at a very unique policy window moment right now, in
Mm.
that we've seen the successes of many of the things that so many advocates have been pushing for years in terms of what the government can do and should be doing. And
Yeah.
I think capitalizing on this moment and making sure that we're able to move forward in a way that grows from where we're at, as opposed to taking us back to where we were and trying to start from zero again, I think is of vital importance. And I don't think that can be done without collaboration across different interest spheres. Like I said, environmental issues, worker issues, advocates working in those areas, as well as food insecurity, food access, etc.
Craig Willingham is the managing director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.